Okay, so Be'ezras Hashem, we are continuing with our weekly series of Shirim on Rav Tzadok and the imagination from Machshavos Charutz, and we're holding in Os Gimel, Os Beis. We've spoken about up until this point how the main way in which a human being is going to express themselves is their capacity to think, and that the main modality of thinking is not the origination of thought, nor is it the extension and the symptoms of thinking, but it's the mid-level of thinking, which is the development of meaning. Resonant meaning that not only shapes the mind, but has an impact upon the lived experience by way of the heart, so that a person shifts their orientation as a result of that thought. And then Rav Tzadok HaKohen Meilublin described the dangers of thinking that goes unhinged and unchecked, which is that it leads to imaginations of perfection, imaginings of perfectibility, where I forget about the fact that I am a creature and I fall into the trap of thinking myself as a creator because of the capacity of my imaginative thoughts. And how that has led to so many issues throughout history, because when a person forgets their inherent imperfection, then they lose sight of the fact that only God is truly perfect. And so Rav Tzadok continued, and he said that once we've identified the main way in which thinking works, because thinking is the main thing that we have to do, so then Rav Tzadok goes in to discuss what we should be thinking. And here Rav Tzadok cultivates a perspective of emunah, thoughts of faith, where like Avram Avinu, we learn to overcome that natural tendency of thinking that thought has to be about something absolute, and we move beyond the absolute nature of intellectualism and clarity, and we jump into the space of faith. Emuna, that was what HaKadosh Baruch Hu loved most about Avram Avinu. He was nearly perfect in all areas. The one thing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu loved and chose to create a nation from was his willingness to move beyond the desire to know, to enter into a space of the unknown, which is the cultivation of faith. And we said that faith is this exilic thing that needs to utilize the imagination to conjure up a clarity that's not available to the mind at that moment, but that nevertheless can be conjured up by way of rectified imagination that feeds into the space of Emunah. And that we can draw down a wisdom of Emunah, which is a knowing that we don't know, which gives us freedom to choose how we would like to frame our experiences. And Rav Tzadok continued, and he explained that the only reason that we have this capacity is because it is an inbred trait within us. It's a pre-existing condition, which is that the Jewish mind will naturally find within itself that innermost point of faith. Faith, which is the meaning making, faith, which is the insistence upon a logos, a meaningful shape in which existence takes place in front of me. And this is ultimately the purpose of contracting our minds so that we can center in on that innermost point of faith, which is the elevation of the imagination back up from its symptomatic territory, back up into the place of clarity. What we're going to discuss now is just such an incredibly rich and powerful description of thinking, where Rav Tzadok is going to explain the necessity of guarding our thoughts. That once we identify the main way in which our thinking operates and the content of what our thinking should be, which is thoughts of faith, thoughts of clarity, in spite of the fact that we're in a space of lack of clarity. Rav Tzadok here is going to tell us about the effort needed to uphold the stronghold of wisdom. That Chachma takes effort. It takes an effort to be a thinking creature in this world. The mind has to be perpetually activated. The mind has to insist upon meaning. That if I'm able to focus my thinking, if I'm able to reduce the all too natural noise of the mind, which is where those negative imaginations come from, and I'm able to hold the innermost point of mind, which is attention, which is das, which is the ability to focus in on one particular thing, so then my mind is going to be the vehicle through which I redeem the world, through which I reveal the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu everywhere. But if I give in to the natural shape and the neurochemistry of the mind, where the mind just wants to express itself in any which way, and it's a laziness of thought, where thought does not want to uphold a system or a vision or a fine-tuned pinpoint orientation to that which is most important. The mind wants to slip slide back into its natural fluidity, where it just thinks thoughts because those thoughts are passing through the threshold of the mind, no matter what those thoughts are. And that's where the symptoms of destructive imagination come from. Left to its own devices, abandoned to the natural proclivity of itself, the mind will express itself downwards to the degree that the imaginations become imaginations of temptation and artificial wholeness that I can try and fight from someplace else, where I become preoccupied, like Rav Tzadok says. But to focus our thought, to strengthen our thought, like Rav Tzadok already explained, that thought is a constrictive thing. It's a closing off of the mind. It's a reduction of the volume of the mind so that there's one singular point within my vision that enables me to have a pinpoint relationship with that which is most essential. That's the koyach of chachma. Only then, when I reduce it by strengthening the intensity and the walls of my thinking, to contain the thought that must be thought and to deny the natural floating back into all of the other random thoughts, that itself is the act of thinking. It's an aspect of strength. The names associated with moichin are names of gevura because to think means to contain an idea. The Tikkun Zohar says, based on the pasuk of Melech Asur Berihitim, that the king is tied up in cords, cords of love. The Tikkun Zohar in Tikkun Vav says as follows: Melech Asur Berihitim Asur Berihite Demoicha. The king that's tied up in cords is in truth the king Melech Malchi Amlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who's tied up within the thoughts of our mind, that we trap HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, in our minds. That when we think about God, we are capturing the process in which God is revealing himself through ourselves. But without the containment, without the constriction of thinking, without the building of the muscle to say, this is what I want to think, and I'm not going to allow myself to fall into the laziness of thought, then my mind is going to float back to where it floats to. And this is what Rav Tzadok says. Now that we know what the main purpose of being a human being is, which is to think, and we know the way in which thinking takes shape, which is a thought that has the ability to imprint itself upon the emotionally lived experience where feelings take shape. And then Rav Tzadok goes further on and tells us the danger of unbridled imagination and the rectification, which is to think about one thing, which is emunah. Here, Rav Tzadok is telling us about the effort and the labor of thinking that is going to be necessary. It is not a simple thing. The mind has to hold itself. The mind has to be on point. The good news is that if the mind deviates, it can return back gently back to the center point, and it doesn't have to be upset about the fact that it deviated. But we can't deny the natural tendency of the mind to deviate back to that natural course of just thinking thoughts without any intensity or specificity, which leads us into that territory of fantasy and unbridled imagination. The mind has to return back by way of gvura to gently remind the mind of its strength, that it has the ability to focus in. And that if I can learn the art of focusing in on one particular thought, then nothing is going to take me away from that thought. I'll be able to trap it in my mind. The opposite is the laziness of thought. The laziness of thought is when I allow my mind to stop being the barrier at which point I decide what I want to think. If I don't strengthen the borders of the mind, if I don't enable the mind to become the partition that separates me and existence so that it can help me domesticate existence by way of thinking and by way of framing and by way of conjuring up imaginative concepts of faith, etc., so then the mind stops protecting the person from the outside, and all of the outside noise and all of the stimuli flood the individual. And then we're like an animal. We're no longer human. To be human is to be able to create a partition within the mind that enables me to block out existence so that I can now translate existence by way of thinking rather than just being exposed to it. Instead of operating in a reactive position where inexistence happens to me and I'm left struggling, I become proactive because actually existence doesn't happen to me. Existence is funneled through this remarkable tool called thinking. And thinking, if I know how to do it properly, I know exactly what it's going to bring me to. It's going to bring me to the one point at the heart of all things, which is the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But it needs to be sturdied, and the boundary and the border of thinking needs to be structured in such a way that its walls are fierce. And the way to do that is by actively engaging in the process of thinking, choosing what I want to contemplate, not allowing my mind to fall prey to the all-inclusive nature of whatever floats into my thinking. So we're talking here about allowing the mind to become the partition, to become the wall, to become that point that protects me from the outside, because I am enabled to domesticate it by way of making meaning, by way of faith and imagination. If I'm lazy with the mind, if I allow the mind to descend back into its porous nature that just wants to kind of be the vehicle of whatever stimuli float through it, so then my entire self is going to be inundated with exposure to triggers, and I'm going to be acting in an impulsive way. So Tzadok is giving us a very delicate, very deep responsibility of strengthening our minds and realizing that the truest barrier, the truest place in which I get to cultivate, domesticate, transform, make meaning out of existence is in the mind. And it's not just an intellectualism that escapes reality, it's a thinking that forms reality so that it can then whisper itself down into my feeling heart, enabling me to find HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the world. Listen to the words of Rav Tzadok. He's quoting the pasuk in Koheles, which says, "Uba'atzaltem yimach hamikra," that in your laziness, the ceiling begins to sag. The ceiling is what protects the house from the outside, from the extremities of the house. And it's only by the guarding of the ceiling. It's only when we guard it and we cultivate it and we strengthen and we know its boundaries and we are responsible with it. Only then will the ceiling continue to protect us from the outside. But with laziness, the ceiling begins to sag and the outside begins to impress itself upon the inside, and the self is all but lost. Perush says Rav Tzadok, "Hamoach hu hamikare kol hagufa adam bepoyel v'chein bekoach, ki binyan hagashmi hu tselem v'demus haruchani." Says Rav Tzadok, listen to what he says. He says that the mind is the ceiling of the individual. The mind is the ceiling of the body, both in potential and in actualization. Meaning to say, on a practical physical level, as well as in a spiritual, neuro-spiritual level. On a physical level, the mind is the tippy top point that separates me from that which is outside of me, like the ceiling that protects the house from the expression from above. And so too, on a psycho-spiritual way, the mind is that transitionary space in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu reveals himself to me and I relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so the mind is the ceiling. And what is it about this relationship between the body and the psycho-spiritual process that reflect one another? Meaning, why is it that the mind is the tippy-top part of the soul and the head is the tippy-top part of the body? Why is there an equality between the soul and the body? Says Rav Tzadok in the most potent way that the physical body is a tselem and demus of the spiritual body, meaning to say that the body itself is an externalized reflection and garment that engarbs a spiritual body, which is taking place in the same shape. So the mind is the barrier between me and the outside, protecting me from the inundation of the outside. Ukamo hatikra hamagina al habayis me zerem ume matar ume choyim vekor ukeyotze me hazeko sachitzanyim shaliachasnu lifnim habayis. Kachamoach shebo mishkan haneshama hatahoira magin al halev veklal haguf shaliachanis lipnimius devarim chitzanyim. That just as the ceiling protects the house from the rain and the flow and the heat and the cold, and all of the damaging and destructing things that take place on the outside that would inundate the inside so that they don't enter into the home. So too the mind, the thinking mind of the individual, protects the purity of the soul, and it protects the gentleness of the heart and the general shape of the body, that it should not be over inundated with an expression from all of those things that exist outside of it, meaning to say that unending flow of thought that can drown an individual without the strengthening of thinking. Al kain nikru gam kain klal yisrael tikra social olam. It's not only in the house that this metaphor applies, or in the individual mind. Klal Yisrael is also referred to as the ceiling of the world, because Nishmas Yisrael is a collective, and therefore all of the various thoughts that each and every Yid has is the Nakuda of Moshe within us. And when that Nakuda of Moshe is unified with other Nakudas of Moshe, it becomes the collective thought of Nishmas Yisrael, of the Olam of Klal Yisrael. And the Tzaddik has the ability to think in that way, because the das of Moshe Rabbeinu corresponds to the das of the entirety of Israel, but the das that the Jewish people are able to hold on to. The rectification of imagination and the transformation of imagination into a sturdy form of faith that works to impart meaning and reasonable purpose in each and every individual's life. That is the ceiling of the world. That is the barrier that separates the world from the chaotic stirrings of a regression back to before the Torah. Just like Chazal said, the pasuk says, Yisrael mekoirai. that Yisrael call out to me. Shehim Maginim Kain al Klal Ha'olam. Chazal say that they're also considered the ceiling of the world. Just as the mind protects us from the outside, so too the cultivated wisdom of Klal Yisrael, the Torah Hakadosh and Nishmas Yisrael, serves the same purpose for the entirety of the world. Shehim Maginim Gam Kain al Klal Ha'olam. That through the learning of Torah, through the cultivation of meaning and faith, we are serving as the protection of the entire world and ensuring that it maintain its rectification and not revert back to Tohu and chaos. That if it were not for our minds, if it were not for the protective elements and the strengthening of our mind to protect meaning at all costs and to guard the imperfection of the human being as the apple of our eyes, to always realize that the depth of the Torah is continuously teaching us that that only Hashem's holiness is truly perfect. Our holiness is always secondary and in need of growth, not because of deficiency, but because of the very simple fact that we are not God. And we protect the entirety of existence with this rectified form of thinking. And if not, the world would be inundated. We would be inundated by all of the exposure and all of the overwhelming content that's flowing. It literally means that Klal Yisrael is the ceiling of the world, that through our capacity of seeing the holiness and the spark of Elokus that rests hidden within the externality of reality, in that way we are giving shape to reality. We are upholding reality. We're protecting reality from losing sight of its innermost meaning and descending down into externalization completely, which transforms it into a jungle again, God forbid. Because the natural proclivity of the self and the natural proclivity of the world and the natural proclivity of externalization and overwhelmingness and all of the myriad details that appear to scatter without any centering point, the natural desire of that is to inundate, is to take over. Like the raging waters of the flood, it wants to occupy any possible space. And left to its own devices, the overwhelming noise of Rome on the outside, which is the overexposure to all sorts of thoughts and perceptions and conceptions and images and misconceptions and lies and falsehoods and all of the narrative structures that compose the noise that blots out the light of Elokus in this world, it naturally wants to descend down and inundate the individual. And if it were not for our mind that was perpetually strengthening itself and remembering meaning, then we wouldn't be able to overcome it. We wouldn't be able to overcome it. We represent the capacity in our own minds to protect us from that overwhelming nature. If we're not for the strengthening of the mind, if it were not for the building of the muscle of the mind that allows me to tune out the noise and tune in to the light that I so choose to cultivate within my faithful imagination, which is rooted in the engine of thinking, so then it wouldn't be able to sustain itself. And what would happen then is that the human being would stop being an upright creature, which represents our capacity to look upwards towards heaven, like the Tzadok said, and our heads would be bent downwards like the animals that look only at the ground. That's what would happen if we didn't develop and cultivate this ceiling of thinking, the ceiling of the world that protects the world from the inundation of meaninglessness. Because in that case, our mind would not be serving like the ceiling. It would be bent down. It would be receiving from the ground. Like the animals who don't have chachma, like the animals who don't run the risk of falling into broken imagination. Meaning to say, the loss of chachma, the loss of this sealing nature of the mind that has the capacity of maintaining meaning at all costs. If we lose that, we become animal, we become chaos again, but it's not that we're going to destroy, it's not that we're going to choose bad, it's just that we lose out on the gift and the purpose of what it means to be a human being, which is to be a thinking creature. But the Adam shenever ketsalmenu kedmusenu v'goymer liyos kayach habichira biyado huchrach lahagana samayach. The human being who is developed in order to be a choosing volitional creature who's meant to rectify imagination, rectify the animal parts of ourselves, elevate this world, transform it from a jungle into a garden. We need to have protection of the mind. We need to know how to utilize our thinking. We need to know machshavas charutz, how to engrave the thinking, to realize that if I think about Shem Havaya, like Rav Yitzchak Isaac Kamler said, I'm literally engraving it within my mind. And what that in the contemplation in my mind that shines forth with the light of faith in the truest form, it pushes away so much darkness. His boininess, which is the bina within the chachma, the heart and the mind operating together, the true nature of thinking, that enables me to illuminate my world and the world of others with true faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that dispels the darkness. That's what protects us from being inundated by the darkness. But that demands strength, that demands effort. Aval atzla tapil terdema. But laziness of thought, the abandonment of the strength of the mind to its natural proclivities of weakness, it's equal to falling into a state of slumber and unconsciousness. When my mind and the capacity of my mind to make meaning by way of imaginative development of faith, my mind falls down to and then I fall down into that third quadrant of thinking, which is just the ruminations and the endless imaginings that are rooted in all of the things that I'm exposed to. And it's as if I'm in a state of unconscious sleep, like the dreams that are filled with meaninglessness. And someone who's fallen into this weakness and laziness of thinking, where they're not choosing to reattach themselves to the innermost point and to choose to think about HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this moment, and they let their mind fall down into another moment of non-thinking and another moment of unconsciousness, then it's as if we're literally asleep, like the pasuk says, Yoshev batel kiyashan dami. Like the halacha says, Magen Avram says, that someone who's sitting and not thinking, not actively engaged in the cultivation of thought, it's as if they're asleep. Because at that point, the meaningless imaginings of that place of unsupervised imagination, where I begin to daydream about how perfect I am and how good I am and how I don't have to do anything and how I'm not able to do anything, etc., 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 all of those weakness points that keep us stuck, they ascend onto the mind if we're not actively engaged in thinking. The entrance and the falling into this territory of unbridled imagination, where I lose sight on what it means to be a human being, is because of the laziness that allows the ceiling of the mind to begin to sag, to begin to crumble, because I'm not actively engaged in thinking. I'm not strengthening every moment to think thoughts of faith. Derech Hamuna Bacharti. Thinking demands strength. It demands an activism. It demands I'm thinking about this right here, right now. And when I'm thinking about Shavisi Hashem Lenegdi Tamid, so then I have the ability of drawing Hashem down into everything and everything at every moment. And then I start, if I'm not developing and the strengthening my mind, I'm going to fall lahar her b'machshavos shfelos. I'm going to start thinking lowly thoughts, animal thoughts about myself, about the world, about other people. Like we said, eventually this negative form of thinking is going to bring about negative forms of acting. Till the entire house is inundated and broken. The essential nature of what we're responsible to do, the main thing that we have to do, is strengthen ourselves against the laziness of thought. And how do we strengthen ourselves against the laziness of thought? How do we activate our thinking? How do I ensure that I'm actively engaged in healthy thinking? What should I think about? Emuna. And how do I think about emuna? Shavisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. Shavisi Hashem lenegdi tamid. Placing the Shem Havaya in front of me at all moments and at all times, to the point that it's being engraved within my mind, that I know Haya Hoiva Yihya, that which was, that which will be, is all fundamentally bound up with that which is in this very moment, which is the perpetual presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvaydo v'atzmo kavyachol. How do I strengthen my mind and break free from the laziness in order to protect my mind from the overwhelming nature of the outside? The strengthening of the mind takes place by way of the contemplation of Shavisi Hashem Lenegdi Tamid. In the very simple form in which each and every person has basic access to faith, the belief that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world, runs the world, and is engaged with me on every individual level, and everything is exactly as it needs to be. We can actively awaken this place of true and simple faith of God's presence and Shavisi Hashem because it already exists within us. It's a morasha, it's a hand-me-down. It's unbroken, it's rooted deep within the innermost point of my heart. From Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, each and every person has this, like we said. To think about the fact that Hashem fills the entirety of existence, that existence is not separate from God. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu is literally directly in front of me at each and every moment. To understand that in the depth of my thinking, I am encountering God and God encounters me in that place. And that is the point of contact. That's where I need to encounter HaKadosh Baruch Hu. If I strengthen myself in thinking about this and cultivating this baseline of thought orientation of the presence of God, then naturally, not only is the ceiling not going to sag or be weakened, but it's going to strengthen itself and it's going to elevate itself and it's going to begin to receive from lofty thoughts and holy thoughts that come from beyond the ceiling. And by thinking positive thoughts and filling my mind with elokus and contemplating godliness, wherever I look, wherever I walk, however I feel, whatever is happening, to think before and to think after and to try and remember in the middle that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is here. No matter how much it feels that he's not here, no matter how clear it is that he's here in this moment, whatever the orientation is, we have the ability of remembering and drawing it down. Each and every moment, the mind has the ability to choose to think that and not to focus too much on getting rid of the negative thoughts. If I focus in on the positive thought, the negative thoughts are going to fall away naturally. Because those negative thoughts come about from what? They come about from the slumber of the mind. But if I'm strengthening my mind and waking up my mind, so then those thoughts are going to go away. When it comes to this, a person has to strengthen themselves and awaken themselves to thinking again in each and every moment. Each and every moment, the person has to strengthen themselves to think again. Because even if I fell in my thinking a moment before, that doesn't mean I can't strengthen myself in my thinking right now. Like the sailors on the ship, as it was breaking, said to Yonah ben Amittai, why are you sleeping? Strengthen your mind, strengthen yourself. Why are you giving up? We have to understand exactly what all of the Kadmonim taught us, that this world is like a tumultuous sea. It's like a sea that's shattering the ship. And the individual goes through this world in a rickety boat that seems to be at the cusp of breaking. And it's also explained this way in the Zohar and the Tikkunei Zohar. It's all hinting to Yonah ben Amittai, who is the individual caught up in the waves of the sea, and we cannot allow our minds to weaken. Like the Zohar Kadosh says that the Svina ihi reisha, the ship is the mind, the liba, the gufa, and the heart and the body, va'oiniyad ihu gufa, and the ship is the body itself, and it seems that it's going to break. And we're going to see that the first thought is Shivisi Hashem Lenegdi Tamid. What we're going to see next week, Be'ezras Hashem, is Rav Tzadok is going to go through the three ways of thinking that Chazal say, to think words of Torah. And if that doesn't work, then think words of Kriyat Shema. And if that doesn't work, then think about the day of one's death, think about transiency. And we're going to see how these three categories of thinking are enabling a person to cultivate deeper and deeper levels of faith, Be'ezras Hashem.